and as you just introduced, we are grad students in the Geography Department at UCSB. We're here as part of Geography Awareness Week, which is where other grad students like us, as well as faculty members and undergrads, go out into the community and give presentations at schools to kind of help people get a better idea of what geography is actually about. And today, as part of our presentation, we're here to tell you a little bit about how transportation has affected the development of some U.S. major cities.
Yeah, so just to begin, we want to get an idea of what you think about when you hear the word geography.
Right, so what do you think geographers do all day? Okay, maps.
Yeah.
Maps, pretty common.
Study the change in the land.
What's this?
Study the change of the land.
That's
Very
one.
good.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Other guesses?
Other ideas? Still a lot that hasn't been covered.
Yes.
Adventure.
What's that?
Adventure.
Adventure, yeah, there's like field work going out in
Yes.
the field. Doing
Depends on your
research,
definition of adventure, let's just say that.
So, yeah.
But yeah, so it seems like we've had some good guesses so far.
So geography is not just limited to things like knowing where things are or kind of the physical features on the earth, or memorizing state capitals or
Yes.
names of countries, or even just making maps.
Right.
Because these are a lot of things that geographers do sometimes, but like we want you to know that it's not limited to
Right.
this. So
Yeah, typically when you tell someone, oh, I'm a geographer, like, oh my god, are you really good at like knowing where you are on the map and stuff? No. They're like, oh, so I bet you know all the state capitals and all the countries in the world. That's really cool.
so not true.
Also not true. And then there are the people who confuse this with geology, right? Like, oh, cool, I like rocks too. It's like, well, okay, that's nice. Yeah. So
although there is some overlap.
yes,
with
there is some
geology,
overlap. Depending,
so.
yes. Some geographers study rocks, but that's a different story. But yes, so we do these things as part of what we do. But we also, there's actually a lot more to it. So probably the easiest and simplest way of explaining what it is that we do is that we study how things happen in space. And when we say space, we don't mean like outer space. We mean space like the world around us, right? We also study the relationships between places. So relationships between different cities, between different countries, or even between just neighborhoods, different parts of a neighborhood, and so on. We also study the physical and social phenomena of places. So yes, some geographers do study rocks. People study soils, people study landforms.
changes.
Yes, how land changes, land use changes over time, climate and stuff like that. Also the human activity that goes on in places, like culture, religion, economic activity, where people live as compared to where they don't live, and so on. So kind of a broad range of subjects in there. And then probably the most relevant to what we're going to be talking about today is that we also study the flows of people, ideas, and things from one place to another. So when things go from place to place, they don't just magically appear, right? They have to get there somehow, and how they get there is transportation, which is what we'll go into a little bit now.
Okay, so in talking about transportation, we're going to look at a few case studies, like how cities around the U.S. have developed over time. So this is a map from 1776 of New York City, and you can see that basically what we're looking at is like the tip of Manhattan. So Manhattan stretches much further up, past where you can see on this map, but the fact is that it started to develop in just this very little dense tip of Manhattan. And so part of this reason was because the way people were getting around in those days were walking or using horses, but basically like you want things to be pretty dense, like pretty close to each other, and so you can get from like one side of town to another. So a little background on New York City. Originally it was founded by the Dutch in 1614, and the location on a natural harbor was really important to New York City's development. So it was a very important place for importing and exporting goods, so you can move goods and people very easily. And so for these long distance kinds of transportation
Like
at the
to
time,
Europe and stuff.
to Europe, then boats were your only option. So, and then within the city, most people were walking or using horses.
Right. And then later on, canals also became important. So we're going to touch on that in a second when we tell you about Chicago. But one thing that the canal system sort of did was really help cement New York City's reputation as like a trade hub. So I guess you guys have heard of like the Erie Canal, right? And all the canal systems up in that part of the country. So once that opened up, it was a lot easier to get things from like the Midwest to the market, whether that was on the East Coast or even in Europe. But I don't know if you guys remember, fur was like a really big thing coming out of the Midwest a long time ago. There was a huge market for that in Europe, and I guess in the Midwest there were a lot of animals who had fur that you could take from them. But anyway, also crops and things like that. So it would be very easy because it's on the Great Lakes. If you can get your things onto a boat, get them down the canal, get them to New York, they can then be taken anywhere on the East Coast or all the way to Europe. So kind of just helping cement that reputation.
Okay, and here's another map also of New York City, just of Manhattan. But basically you can see the growth of the city in just like, I guess this is like 35 or so years. So what we saw earlier was kind of like this little area down here. And it looks a little more haphazard compared to the very regular grid in the rest of the city. So this is just, it's highly planned, very regular streets that meet at right angles, and so it makes it easier to get around.
Right, when you're walking, you want to know how many more blocks you have to walk before you have to turn and so on.
So it like divides the city into very kind of easy to figure out.
Very manageable chunks, I would say.
Okay, and this is a view of the New York City skyline in kind of more modern day. So you can see that it's very dense. As far as you can see, there's buildings, and you can also see how far out like New York City has grown. So basically, it's not only grown outwards a little bit, but at some point, to keep the city as dense as it is, then you have to also grow
Upwards, like with the skyscrapers, right? And this sort of contributes to its walkability because, you have all this stuff packed into a pretty small actual land area, so a small footprint there. So even though once you get to where you're going, you might have to take an elevator up to actually get there, you can easily just walk a few blocks to wherever you're trying to go and still do that, even though there's all this stuff going on. So growing up as well as out is one way to kind of keep this walkability.
Yeah, especially as the city grows in population, like you have to have space for all these people. Washington D.C., this is actually my hometown, but it's also the nation's capital. And originally it was built on swampland, and the location for Washington D.C. as the new capital was chosen as sort of a balance of power between the north and the south. So it was considered like not too far north or not too far south as the nation's capital. And the original plan was designed by Pierre L'Enfant in 1791. And so he has French background, and he was modeling the city plan off after cities like Paris, where there's very wide French boulevards. You have like tree-lined avenues, pretty low buildings, not seeing a lot of the skyscrapers. And so DC is like built as a symbol for the nation, so there's a lot of monuments, a lot of parks, and these wide boulevards. And so this is Pierre L'Enfant's original plan for the city. You can see where it's located on these rivers here, which is always pretty important in terms of transporting. But you can also see like the regular grid laid out on the city, as well as these wider avenues that run diagonally across the city in a lot of places. So it connects different sectors of the city, and also it's just in the places where these avenues meet, there's often a park that might be centered with a monument. So it contributes to this grand image of the nation's capital. Okay, and this is an image of one of the parks. This is Farragut Square, and the monument there in the center is for David Farragut. He was a Union admiral in the Civil War. So this is kind of like a place where people can enjoy the day, but also this grand kind of monument there. And you have a very good view, like down one of these wide avenues. So you can see pretty far in a lot of different directions in the city. And you can see here also that the buildings are not super high like the skyscrapers you might see in New York City. Okay. And this image is from the March on Washington. So this is to demonstrate that basically Washington, D.C. is a very important place as a symbol for the nation, and it's like a political staging ground for kind of these, like for example, this historic moment in the civil rights movement. So this is where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech. It was a very important down here from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to the Washington Monument. And this body of water is the floating pool. It's like, just basically reflects the Washington Monument there. So, you can see also like that so many people can kind of like, get from place to place here. And when you're down on the National Mall in downtown DC, it's very walkable.
Right.
You can walk from monument to monument. It's very important to get a lot of people out to show support for like a political cause. And nowadays there are still a lot of protests that are held in Washington DC. So people from all over the country will come to like march or protest.
Right. And of course, like you said, this walkability does contribute to that. You can walk and have your fellow protesters walking down the street without getting run over by big trucks. That's a safety factor. You know, and so this all sort of contributes. You can walk past a lot of important buildings, have important people see your message. So walking is really key here. So there's a reason they called it the March on Washington and not the car ride on Washington. So
Yeah, so here also you get a lot of like national coverage, so you get a lot of news to help support your cause. This is another view in DC, and this is looking down Pennsylvania Avenue here to the US Capitol. And if you think about the US Capitol here, it's actually located very close to National Mall where all the monuments were that you saw in the last picture. And in this image it's very clear that the skyline looks very, very different than say New York City or Chicago or something with a lot of skyscrapers. So in DC there's a building height limit, and so it contributes to a very different feel for the city.
alright. So the next city we have to tell you about is Chicago, which was founded in 1832, and originally it was founded thanks to the canal system. So that's what really helped it, you know, become what it was, because it's located right on the Great Lakes, right on Lake Michigan. So that way, if you could just get your stuff, whatever it was you wanted to sell, to Chicago, then you could easily send it from Chicago down through the canals and then out into the world, right? But then also, you know, railroads became a bigger, more prominent mode of transportation, and Chicago actually became America's main railroad hub, which it still is today. So this is important in terms of freight, so like the goods that we keep talking about, like the furs, crops, etc., whatever it is that you're selling, but also in terms of moving people from place to place. So this is just a map showing commuting times in the Chicago area.
So if you kind of look at the key there, it's a little hard to see on this overhead, but basically the shading represents like how long it takes via rail to get to different places. So the parts of the rail lines that are shaded there are like how far you can reach in a certain amount of time. So basically you can see that from the center of Chicago, the rail lines kind of spread out in all different directions. So besides going into Lake Michigan, you can pretty much get to anywhere else from Chicago. So this was an important hub, kind of like bring things in or take things out of there, move people.
Right. And also another thing, so this is sort of kind of a precursor to urban sprawl. Do you guys know what urban sprawl is? Do you want to guess?
I guess.
So if it's sprawl that's urban, what might this mean? What's this?
More cities or spreading something?
Yeah,
So
that's a little bit
spreading.
spreading
Spreading is definitely key. Others? Alright. So the thing to remember, so urban sprawl is where you have cities that sort of develop and they keep just going outwards and outwards. And you'll see this a lot more in the other cities that we talk about a little bit later. But this is just sort of the beginnings of it. Typically urban sprawl is associated with people using cars a lot, because with cars you can go a lot faster and go a lot further. But here what you can see is that thanks to the rail system, people can come in from a farther distance and go out to a farther distance. So you can imagine this is sort of like a precursor to urban sprawl. It's not really urban sprawl, but you can kind of imagine this like setting the framework for that, like setting up for this. And this right here is just a map, a rail map showing you how Chicago is connected to a bunch of different rail lines. So here we have Chicago, and it goes in a lot of different directions. You can see the tip of New York here, and then Pennsylvania. You can see Virginia, it goes down into Tennessee, and probably even past there. That's just where the map cuts off. And even out further in these directions, and they all sort of converge on Chicago. And that just should sort of help you to visualize why this is such an important city. Like all of these things going through, through the rail system to Chicago, or coming from Chicago back to wherever they're going. So, pretty big deal when it comes to railroads. this is just a view of the skyline. You can see Lake Michigan up here, and then, so as opposed to DC, what you can see is that there has been a little bit of upward growth too, vertically. So we did have that growth outwards from the rail system, right? But we also can see there's skyscrapers, so maybe looking a little bit more like New York than DC. Oops, went too fast there. So Atlanta is the next city we're going to tell you about, and that's one that's near and dear to my heart because I'm originally from Georgia. So it was founded around 1836 because the Georgia General Assembly decided that it would be a good idea to build a railroad connecting the port of Savannah to the Midwest, and more specifically Chicago. So we saw from that previous map, you know, why they might want to do that, why they might think it's such a good idea. And the original ending point for construction was in the Atlanta area, so they called it terminus. So if you can think, the word terminate means to end something, to stop. So then terminus is a pretty good word for stopping point. But fortunately, around 1847, it got renamed, which I think was probably a good move on their part. It got renamed to Atlanta, which is short for Atlantica Pacifica. And that sort of is reflective of their desire at the times to connect the whole country via the railroad system. So, kind of building the country together through the railroads from the Atlantic to the Pacific. You can kind of see where this came from. So it really grew up. It quickly became a regional rail hub and was a really important supply hub or military hub for the Confederacy. So probably their best way of getting troops where they needed to go, getting supplies where they needed to go, getting sick people brought back in so they could be tended to, and so on. So you can imagine after the fall of Atlanta that things did not go so well for the Confederacy, right? You have those three main battles in Atlanta, like the Battle of Ezra Church and the Battle of Peachtree Creek and the Battle of Atlanta, and this is just all part of the bigger siege on Atlanta. And by the time it was through, the city was basically in shambles. Honestly, much of the South was, but the city was, not looking so good. And so they had to rebuild it. So Reconstruction, basically from Reconstruction to World War II, and honestly even up through the present, they rebuilt Atlanta and turned it into the economic and cultural heart of the South. So before, it wasn't quite as much of a population center. Yeah, you had some people living there, but it was really more just market activities. But after the Civil War, you started to see a huge influx of people because, of course, all these freed slaves with nowhere to go. And then you also had maybe people who lost all their money because it was in Confederate bonds, which were apparently worthless at that time, or they really were worthless. So they had to sell their land and had to come to the city to look for work. So when you have all these people coming together in the city, you see a lot of economic development, a lot of cultural development, and even today, when you think of the South, when you think of big cities, probably what you think of is Atlanta, or maybe it should be. So, they were already still a rail hub at this point, and then in 1956, Dwight Eisenhower authorized the construction of the interstate highway system, and Atlanta was going to be a major junction for that. So originally, the interstate actually had two purposes, and just so we're clear, the interstate is what we call the freeway on the East Coast, because it goes through a lot of different states. So it kind of had a dual purpose. So it was for military use, right? This is during the Cold War. We were afraid Russia was going to bomb us at any time, or the USSR as it was then. So you needed to be able to move the military around from place to place quickly. And also, it has really turned into its main use is just civilian use. So for business or personal travel. If you've ever had to drive through the South, you probably had to connect in Atlanta somewhere because of those interstates, which we'll talk about in a second. But the status as a major transportation hub, so you have rail connections, highway connections, and even air, which we won't talk about quite as much, makes it a great place to do business because any goods that you have, like your widget factory, your umbrella factory, whatever it is, you're trying to get these products to where you want to sell them, right? And so it's going to be a lot easier for you if you can just easily get it on a train, get it on a truck, get it UPS to put on a plane, however you want to do it. And our fun fact of the day, I bet you guys did not know that the Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta Airport is the busiest airport in the world. No one is surprised by this? Everyone knew this already. We're just boring you. So I want to be clear, it's not the busiest in terms of Atlanta as a destination. Atlanta is not quite that big yet. But in terms of connections, just flights going through it. So, that's obviously a point of pride for Atlanta and for the South in general. And Delta Airlines, actually, probably one of the reasons for that is that Delta has their main hub in Atlanta. And you can imagine if you are whoever started Delta Airlines, it might make a lot of sense to you to start your airline in a place that already has these other transportation connections, right? Okay, this is a place with a lot of rail connections, a lot of highway connections. Well, I guess I'll start my airline company there too. So a lot of business going on there, various kinds. This is just a map of the greater Atlanta metro area to kind of help you get a feel for what it actually entails. So, you know, we have the different highways going through, so the interstate. So this is I-75 going up this way, and then I-75 going diagonally this way, and then I-20 going kind of horizontally. And then you also have this perimeter, which is I-285, and that just serves to kind of connect these different interstates and also to kind of encircle the town, or what was most of the town at the time, so.
And from this, you can kind of see also like the peach or yellow colored
Yeah.
shading here. That represents like the metropolitan area of Atlanta. So it actually stretches out very far and kind of encompasses many of the suburbs and surrounding towns. So that's all considered part of the Atlanta
Right,
metropolitan.
so not part of the city itself, but part of the greater, like, area.
And for context, like if you go
So here's
from downtown
Atlanta.
Atlanta to Acworth out in the corner
There you
there,
go, there it is.
like so that's a distance of 30 miles.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty big spread.
Pretty long way, so if you imagine like going in these directions to 30 miles in either direction, that's a lot of area there.
Yeah, and these are considered kind of as much a part of Atlanta as the downtown city of
Right.
Atlanta.
Right, and we will get into that a little bit more in a little bit. This is Spaghetti Junction. I learned that it has an actual name, which is Tom Moreland Interchange, but no one calls it that. So it's called Spaghetti Junction because it's where I-85 and I-285 connect to each other. And you can see it kind of looks like a mess. You have also some access roads connecting, so it's like this big, huge, like spaghetti tangle, right? So that's just sort of to give you a feel of what it looks like, and then you may not be able to see this picture too well, but just to sort of give you an idea of what it feels like to go under it, which is pretty cool. I recommend having someone else drive so you can look up and be
Yeah.
amazed.
You can imagine it's probably a little disorienting
Yeah.
driving through it, and you have to have a good idea of where you're going.
Yes,
You need to be over in the right lanes at the right time.
right, so. And then another city we have to tell you about is LA, which is probably a lot more familiar to you guys and closer to your heart. So it was founded by the Spanish in 1781, but it didn't really start growing into what it is today until the early 20th century when they built the aqueduct to bring the water in from Owens Valley. Because even though I'm sure people in Phoenix would disagree with you, when you're in the middle of the desert and you have no water, that maybe is not the best place to have a city, right? If you don't have water, you just can't do a whole lot. But so they got the aqueduct, they got the water, and they were good to go. And if you think about it, so this happened in the early 20th century. By that point, people were not really just walking everywhere that they went, were they? No? You guys saw The Great Gatsby, right? They had cars back then. Maybe not the best cars in the world, but they had cars. There were also street cars. So as a result of this, because when you have a faster mode of transportation, you can cover more ground in the same amount of time, the city developed to be more spread out. And you can see this today, like there's not really a center of town. So there's different parts of town. There's like downtown, Hollywood, Beverly Hills, different areas, but there's not really a core like center area. And another thing which you may or may not have known is that originally in the early 20th century, LA had a huge streetcar network. Everyone always thinks of San Francisco when they think of the streetcars, like the trolleys, you know, or trams, but actually LA had more. Is anyone surprised by this?
Yes.
You nod, okay. Yes, a surprised face, I see, very good. But obviously that has all sort of been replaced by cars now, and it's pretty much the quintessential car city. So here we have a nice picture of downtown, so you can see with the skyscrapers and the mountains in the background, very nice, right? And then zooming out, so here's downtown, and you can see this huge area around it. That's a lot of area, isn't it? That's a lot of stuff. So you have like maybe a residential area here and like business and these.
Yeah, so you see it's like
warehouses.
super built up, like
Right,
you can't see a lot of like ground here, you're mostly
Yes.
seeing a lot of buildings.
right. So just look at in all these directions, so even back that way, so this is pretty big, right? Pretty spread out, I would say. You think so?
If you've ever flown into LAX, you might have seen something similar to
Yes,
this.
it's pretty crazy. So yes.
Okay, and this is a map of the streetcar network in the 1920s, so you can see each of the lines of the streetcar system here. So they connect in a few places, and each of these little words here represent like a station on the streetcar network, so a place you can get onto the streetcar and get off. And so you can see down here is like downtown LA, stretches far out in every direction. Here's like Redondo Beach, Pasadena up here. So keep in mind like how much area the streetcar network covers. It's pretty far, it's not just the downtown area. And then when we look at kind of the freeway system, in the same LA area, the streetcar system may be covering about this much, because again, you see it on the beach there. So it covers this kind of area. And so as forms of transportation become faster and faster, it's like things become more spread out. It's just as easy to get further with different modes of transportation. So on a car, you can get much further than you could with the streetcar system. And you can see all these connections of the highways. You can get into the city as well as just get around when you're in the city.
Right, and if you think about it, that's probably what contributes to a lot of those nasty traffic jams, right? Everyone's on the freeway. Maybe you guys have experienced some of this. I have, it was terrible. It's miserable. But yeah, so a lot of congestion because everyone's in their car because they want to take the freeway.
Okay, so it's not just the LA area, because in a lot of cities are becoming more spread out like this. So the car has a big effect on that. For example, the New York metro area, for example, stretches across 4 states. So there's a lot of people who live in Connecticut or Jersey that will commute into New York City to go to work. So obviously people are using a lot more cars to get around. It's contributing to more congestion in the area. If you ever tried to drive into New York City, for example, not even taking into account the tolls to get into the city, but just the traffic you have to deal with. So there's consequences like the traffic congestion and also just air pollution. So you've seen the smog around LA, things like that.
And stress.
Yeah, stress, driving, and rising gas prices, things like that. So, and then car-centric development also makes it more difficult to like kind of mix with other modes of transportation.
Right, so a good way to think about it is, so imagine a place that you've been, maybe a place that you go where there's a lot of parking. It could be free parking, it doesn't have to be free, but there's a lot of parking. So think about this place. So when you're in this place, do you think it'd be really easy to walk around from one place to another? Or maybe to take a bike or take the bus? Probably not, right? So, you can kind of see, maybe on the other hand, if you think about a place like New York, right, where there's the subway, you can easily take public transit, or you can walk to wherever you're wanting to go. Now imagine trying to find parking in a place like that. It's going to be a real pain, right? And if you can find it, it's going to cost you an arm and a leg, huh? So there are some places where cars and other forms of transportation get along very well, but that's really the exception rather than the rule. So when you build for cars and you build to kind of take them into account, you really kind of edge out these other forms of transportation, make them a lot harder to use.
That's especially when the city was built around like basically just accommodating the car. Like in LA, there wasn't that much consideration for like subway lines they're gonna put in.
Being able to walk to your grocery
or
store.
walkability, yeah, things like that. So. Okay, and so this is a map of the metropolitan area around LA. So you can see kind of LA over here, but then you see you stretch as far as San Gabriel Mountains up here. And obviously it wouldn't make sense to develop much further into the mountains, but then the city also stretches like up and down the coast. So you see like the actual metropolitan area of DC, of LA takes up a lot of space here.
Right.
It's fairly spread out. And then if you're looking at like DC, for example, that we talked about, and then do you know the city of Baltimore, Maryland?
Maybe you've heard of it. Nods. Are you old enough to watch The Wire? Probably not.
So anyway, so these two cities are pretty close together, and both of them are growing pretty fast. And so you can see the metro area of Baltimore is not exactly distinguishable from where that ends, in terms of it kind of just merges into the DC metro area. So you're getting like this, this merging of two different urban areas, and it sort of becomes like one big area.
How far is Baltimore from Washington, D.C.?
So that's probably about an hour and a half kind of drive.
Oh, that's not bad.
Yeah, maybe even like an hour.
That's as long as it
honestly.
takes me to get from my house to Atlanta. That's crazy.
Yeah, so basically on the East Coast, like kind of the way we think of distance is a lot different. Like before I moved to California, it was kind of like the DC to Baltimore drive is like, you know, not worth it unless there's something really special going on. But a lot of people in California might take an hour drive like
You might go,
daily or.
if you have someone, I know a girl who has a boyfriend in the Bay Area and she drives up there every weekend. I couldn't do it.
To me, that's ridiculous,
But
but you know.
you also
like-
thought that was ridiculous too, so.
Yeah,
Your
yeah,
standards change, so.
yeah. So anyway, yeah, so this is kind of a form of agglomeration where cities kind of come together.
Yeah, see, this is what we're teaching our freshmen, actually. We teach a class on we help teach a class on human geography, and they're learning about agglomeration and why things can be located near other similar things.
But this is a college level course, right, so. Yeah, you guys are.
Pretty smart folks.
And so, moving further up the East Coast, we're seeing like here's Philly, somewhere in here, New York City, and Boston up here. And so you can also see like these metro areas almost continuous, like up this part of the coast. And if you imagine that we could fit DC and Baltimore still on the same page, this whole area together is called the Eastern Megalopolis. So has anyone heard the word megalopolis before?
No.
Anyone guess what it means?
Take any Latin or
Greek.
what's that? Yeah, so actually I think mega can represent million, but it just means like very big. So
Big, yes.
polis means city, so it's like just this very big, like kind of urban area. Urban area that like comes together.
So it's all these cities sort of growing into one huge urbanized region together.
So the Eastern Megalopolis is like the most urbanized area in the U.S. So if you take all these into account together. Okay, and so with things like that, like more sprawl and more clustering of cities, like you get a lot more congestion. So this might be a familiar sight to some of you. I
Yes,
don't
this
know.
might look like
It's not that bad in
sometimes.
Santa Barbara though.
Yeah, not typically, hope it isn't.
So a lot of times people are spending a lot of time of their day commuting, so it's, on the East Coast, for example, it's probably not that uncommon to spend like, you know, an hour or more in the car a day, like just going to and from work. And there's even this rising trend of super commuters, which are people who spend like maybe more than an hour each way going to work. They might live a couple states over and, you know, drive that every day, which I think although people are sometimes moving towards longer commutes, a lot of people are looking for options to kind of do shorter commutes or kind of mixed transit modes so that they don't have to just be in the car all day. So now a lot of people are preferring to, when they can, like walk, bike, or take transit in the city. And so a more concentrated city, like kind of what we saw in the case of New York City, is becoming very desirable.
Right, more
So-
dense, closer together.
And so the kind of hassles associated with car ownership are just becoming, you know, too much for some people. Like they don't want to have to deal with congestion, rising gas prices. Sometimes even car ownership is a hassle. If you live in the city, you have to pay kind of, it's almost another rent because you're like paying for your parking space, for example. And in New York City, you know, that's several $100 more a month you're paying.
And especially for young people, you know, in their 20s and 30s, maybe don't have a ton of money, like, do you really want to spend that on a car when it's just going to be a hassle? Maybe not, so.
And then along with that, people are becoming more aware of like environmental impacts. So maybe, like, you know, you don't want to drive your car as much, and you want to have options whenever you can.
Right, so just to kind of highlight this, so 10 years ago, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, when I was a couple years younger than you guys, or if you would have told me that you would see people bringing their own reusable bags to the grocery store, I would have told you were crazy. Like, why would anyone bring their own bag to the grocery store? They give you all the plastic ones you want for free, right? Like, who does that? Or, you know, a lot of times you see people with their Nalgene or their Camelback carrying their water with them. And, you know, back in the day, if you saw people carrying water at all, it would just be in like a plastic bottle that they would throw away when they were done. You wouldn't even recycle it, just throw it away. So in the past 10 years, things have really been changing for the better, I think, in terms of environmental awareness and people being really aware and concerned about what their environment can do to either help or hurt, or what their behavior can do to help and hurt them, or hurt the environment. So
So
you have
there's a lot more
people-
like cultural awareness.
Right, so bringing your own bags to the grocery store, drinking water out of a bottle, all that, all the way up to transportation, like, okay, well, if I take the bus, I can save some emissions and save some money too, probably, but, yeah, things like that.
Yeah, so this is a view of inside of one of the DC metro stations. And so basically the metro system is, well, the metro system is what we call our subway system in DC. And it's great for getting around in the city, but it's also great for if you're a commuter living in the suburbs to like come into the city very easily. You could either park at a metro station or walk or take the bus to the metro station and then just go straight into downtown. Don't have to worry about like where you're gonna park your car or like paying, $15 a day to park your car in downtown DC. So it's very nice to be able to take the metro in. It also serves like millions of tourists in the summer. So like DC is obviously a big destination for tourism, and
Especially the 4th of July.
yeah, 4th of July and all the Smithsonian museums you just go to for free. So basically a lot of people will take the metro around because if you've ever tried to drive through DC in the summer, it's not easy, like super congestion in downtown and like there's really nowhere to park, or if you park, you have to walk almost a mile to get to the monuments. So because of that, like it's much easier just to take the metro in, it's a lot more reliable and you don't have to deal with those hassles. This is a map of the metro system. You can see here, for example, like this little diamond shape is like basically DC proper, and then going outside of that, you can see the metro line stretches into the suburbs, and like Virginia, Maryland up here. And it's also possible to get to the Reagan National Airport from just using the metro. So you can even change modes, like fly into the city and just hop on the metro, go to your hotel, go around town using the metro. So you never have to really deal with a rental car if you're coming into DC. And then also they're expanding the metro, so they're building a new silver line that goes out even further into another part of the suburbs. So there's this area in Northern Virginia called Tyson's Corner, and it's becoming a big technology corridor right now. So a lot of technology businesses are moving there. It's where all the jobs are going. So if you live in the city, for example, and you work out in Tyson's Corner, you could take the metro out there and just go to work that way. And the Silver Line will also connect to the international airport there. So take more international flights as well.
So that was an example of public transit done right. Unfortunately, in cities that have a little bit more sprawl, or okay, let's just say a lot more sprawl, it's a little bit harder to get things done effectively. So you may have heard of MARTA. It's kind of infamous. It's Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority. So here is just a system map to show you where it goes. So this is the perimeter, right? This is the perimeter. So you can see it'll take you, okay, you can go to these places, and you can go to these places, and maybe a little bit outside of the perimeter. When you consider how much of the population of the Atlanta area is outside of the perimeter, this is not an area that's well served by MARTA, is it? So you can kind of see it's not very effective. And then how many of you guys are baseball fans? Couple? Yeah. So have you heard about the Braves Stadium being moved and the whole fuss they've been having about that? Yes. So if you haven't heard, so they're going to move the Braves Stadium, so it's currently kind of near downtown. They're going to move it to Cobb County, which is up in this area. So it's 12 miles. And I at least have been seeing a lot of grumbling about this on my Facebook feed from friends back home, and people being like, why are you doing this? Like, we're trying to boost our downtown. Why on earth would you put this stupid baseball stadium where no one's going to go to it in like the middle of nowhere? But it turns out that most of the tickets that are sold to Braves games are sold to people in Cobb County, which is this area where they're going to move the stadium. So from that perspective, that's just one of the reasons why it does kind of make sense. And this is really a case, this sprawl has gotten so big that the suburbs are starting to outshine the city itself. And if you can look at this map, you can see, okay, well, there is not really a MARTA line that's going to take us to the stadium, and that's been another big source of complaint, because you can imagine the traffic on a game day. And so MARTA has kind of this reputation for being dysfunctional, because it is. So there's even a fake Twitter account dedicated to making fun of it called Fake MARTA. So we found this tweet that I think is really nice. It says, "Attention MARTA ride customers. We're excited to service the new Cobb Braves Stadium. Just transfer to CCT and then transfer to a rental car." So if you're having to take rental cars and you take public transit, chances are it's not really working so well. So now you can see it is kind of a challenge that these spread out cities face. But even car-centered cities like LA are really trying to get public transit going and help it become more of a thing that people use, because you can reduce congestion, reduce pollution, and so on. So you can see here is a bus on the orange line, and that's also called the Metro. You have a coverage map to tell you where all the bus will take you. You can go to Long Beach, you can go into the Valley, you can go to Pasadena. So it does, because it is more spread out, it does have kind of a long way to cover. So that's kind of a challenge. And then also important is this map, because it tells you where you can take the bus, where the bus will come every 15 minutes or less. Because when you're trying to promote public transportation, you really want people to see it as something that they can rely on, right? So imagine, you're a commuter and you're tired of driving to work every day, and you're like, well, I just as soon save that gas money, I guess I'll take the bus. And the bus ride from your house to your work is like 5 or 10 minutes, so that's not bad, right? That's pretty awesome. But if that bus comes only once an hour and you miss it, you're probably going to get in some trouble with your boss, or you're going to have to find some other way to get to work. So it's important not just to think about the travel time, but also to emphasize how often the buses come, because if you can, if you know that, all right, so if I miss this bus, another will come pretty quickly, or if the bus is late, another will be coming quickly, then you can feel a lot more comfortable relying on that for your daily transportation and your daily needs, right? Kind of makes sense. So just some other ways to get around
so
town.
some other ways that you can get around downtown. We talked a little bit about walking, there's light rail, and who's heard of a bike share system? Anyone?
A little bit,
Couple?
couple
Yeah.
people.
Okay, so basically a bike share system is like, you can rent a bike from one station and basically bike to another station and drop it off there. You don't have to worry about having a bike. If you're changing modes of transportation, like the metro into the city, you can then get on the bike without having to bring the bike with you. You don't have to worry about bike theft or anything like that.
Right.
And also just the growth of these kinds of systems, like this is in Washington DC, but they're also in like all over Boston, Chicago, New York City.
Even Paris.
Yeah, so Paris was one of the original places it started. But basically, like, this has also spurred more bicycle infrastructure, so the more people that are out using these bike share bikes, they're putting in more bike lanes, and then bike lanes also make it easier for people to bike in the city, so it's kind of like, it's just a snowball effect. So the more people you see out riding a bike, the more you might think of it as a viable option for doing that.
Yes, so this is probably one of my favorite pictures when it comes to transportation. So this is a picture of Portland, Oregon, which is a city that's pretty known for being, very public transit friendly and easy to get around. And so if you look at this picture, what you notice is there's a lot of different forms of transportation going on in the same picture. So you see these people on bikes in the foreground, that might be the first thing that you notice, and then you have some people walking here, and this person. You also have buses, and they have their own special little bus lane so they don't get caught up in any traffic and they can kind of stay on schedule. You see people in their private car going wherever it is that they're going. And then there's one thing that you don't see right off the bat at least, but you can see evidence that it's there. And that is the light rail system, because you see these little tracks here and going here. So that's for like your, whatever you want to call it, your trolley, streetcar, tram. So it's not in the picture, but it's there. And so this just is a really great illustration of the diversity of ways to get around that don't necessarily have to be in cars.
Yeah, so we saw that that provides a lot of choices for people. So one thing that some ways that geographers are involved in all this is that, for example, in urban planning, they'll help decide how to structure new development. So where things are developing, putting in new shopping center, and maybe how to connect that to the rest of the city very well. Things like studying transportation, so you can model kind of patterns of movement within a city or within a larger metropolitan area. So you can decide where people, you can model where people are going, what modes of transportation they're using, what time of day they're making their trips, like going to work or shopping. And so when you model all these kinds of movements and flows through the city, you can then model what will happen if you change one of these things. So if you put in another lane on this road, or if you open up, a new roundabout.
Oh, like the one, at Calreal and Los Carneros.
Yeah, so you can sort of like see the effects ahead of time and kind of inform planning.
Right.
So you might discover that changing this will actually cause congestion over here, whereas that wasn't your initial goal.
Yeah. It's better to find these things out before you actually pay to build them and go through that trouble. So, and Crystal's in a class on that now, so this is a thing that even people at UCSB are doing right now.
Yeah, so modeling like travel behavior, the kinds of things that go into how people make decisions about what modes of transportation they're using and where they're going, what time of day, things like that. So basically it's important to consider all these different things together, like different modes of transportation, like not planning just for the car, but also kind of like, hey, how are we gonna make it more walkable for people who live in these communities?
Like how you plan to use the space too, so.
Okay, and some points to remember from the presentation. So transportation has a huge impact on the form of a place. So you see a lot of these cities that grew up around certain modes of transportation, and those modes like railways and things like that have helped shape like what you can do and how connected the city is to other cities, for example. And with these faster modes of transportation, it's actually encouraging development to spread out some more. So because of that, as we move to things like cars, then the city itself is becoming like more spread out or sprawling. And then people today are becoming more drawn to urban areas that support a variety of transit options. So not just driving around, like you might still want your car to like go to the grocery store.
Or that
for example.
Costco run.
Yeah, but you could still, maybe people want to be able to walk to dinner or walk to meet their friends or just take the metro to work. And so it's important to remember that transportation is just one aspect of geography, and geography covers a lot of different things. So we're not just talking natural or physical kind of geography, but also human geography, like study of people, things like radio migration.
Yeah, so when I first started out in geography, I thought that I wanted to be a geomorphologist, who is someone who studies landforms, how they're formed, the things that affect them, and so on. Then I remembered that I don't like going outside, and I don't like getting dirty, and I don't like being too hot or too cold. So I decided it was probably time to change that. So I was like, well, I discovered human geography, and I decided to go into economic geography, and I also work a lot with migration, like where people are going. And I was able to do this. I didn't even have to change my major to do this, which was great. I mean, from an administrative perspective, I didn't have to fill out a lot of paperwork. But I also think that's one of our strengths, is that geography really encompasses so much. We do everything. We do all sorts of things. Like, we have faculty members who are in marine science. We have faculty members who study soils, who study the climate and how it's changing. Water resources. We have 2 urban planners who do like vastly different things. We have people who study cognitive and behavioral geography, so sort of how you understand space, the psychology of geography. Who else? I feel like there's more people that I'm forgetting. We do have a cartographer.
A lot of GIS people.
Yes, so that's like more in terms of sort of organizing space, with computers, or understanding, like making a system map of your sewer lines or something. Understanding like, okay, these manhole covers have been replaced at this time or such and such.
Or the spread of disease, like in medical geography.
Yes, so that's not someone we do have on the faculty right now, but that is also a really important area of geography. So if you're thinking about going to med school someday, if you're into that, a lot of geographers work in epidemiology, so like understanding the spread of disease and so on. So medical geography could be something you could consider maybe for a double major or something like that someday. So yeah, so there's a wide range of things that geographers do and study. So hopefully, if you take at least one thing away from this, hopefully you will have taken away more points than just that, but hopefully you've at least learned from this that geography is more than just like reading maps and so on. So, are there questions?
Come on, guys, you gotta have some questions.
Yes.
Why did you choose UCSB?
For grad school? Well, actually, so I applied on a whim. I didn't think I would get in. They have a pretty good graduate program in geography.
I would say one of the best.
One of the
in
best. We don't.
country.
I don't like to brag on myself. But yeah, so
Yeah, one of the best geography
yeah.
programs.
So I didn't think I would get in, but then they offered, and I was from the South. I was like, well, I'll just stay in the South, you know. But then they offered me more money than anyone else, and it was the best program I applied to. So it was like, well, I guess I'm moving to California. So
Yeah, and for me, I kind of wanted to move further away, so.
yeah,
I'm from the East Coast and I grew up on the East Coast, so
yeah,
wanted to try something different. And
yeah. That's
attracted
attractive
to
too.
the program here.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you know what was the biggest impact to like transportation, in America, or?
Let me think. Wait, sorry.
Depends on who you ask. Biggest impact?
Transportation.
Like in development of cities?
I would say,
Industrial Revolution, airlines.
I would say maybe cars. I think cars have been like the most, at least in terms of the most radical change, because yes, you can, even in some cases, maybe railroads are faster, but you can't really control where you go. But cars really took off because if you have a car, you can go anywhere. I mean, anywhere there's a road, and if you have like four-wheel drive, you can really go anywhere. And that's something I think that really appeals to people, especially like Americans. And so if you think of how that has transformed the world around us, like we live in a very car-based society. So
Yeah, but I think it depends on who you ask.
Yeah.
That's actually a good question.
that is a really good question. So. Yes.
What's the effect of zip cars in urban areas?
Oh, I love that. That's a good question. I had to explain to someone what a zip car was the other day. So I would say you don't see them everywhere just yet, and I've mostly noticed them in like college towns where they already are gonna have a good
Big
market.
cities, yeah.
Yeah, I don't-
BC, we have some
that's,
cars.
I'm sure. So I don't know that it's really making a big impact in itself, but as part of like this larger trend of people shifting away from cars, I can only imagine that it's sort of helping that, like people knowing, okay, well, I can have a car if I need it to like get to an appointment or go to Costco or something like that, and then not have to worry about it the rest of the time.
It
I'm sure
takes
it's
away
really-
some of like the ownership costs, you
Yes.
know, of having a car, so if you can use Zipcar, it's like part of this greater trend of like bike share is along the same lines.
Bike share,
And
car
if you've heard
share.
of car to go, that's like
Yeah.
similar except for you can just drop the car at almost any point.
That's convenient.
Yeah, you don't have to do a round trip in a Zipcar.
Yes.
What is a zip car?
Yeah.
Okay, so Zipcar is kind of like a bike share program that we talked about, but it's for
Public
cars.
car sharing.
Yeah, so a lot of times, like there's one in IV where you pick up the car, like you'll pay, do you pay in advance? I don't know. But so you'll.
You can pay with an app.
Yeah, no, so when I was teaching a friend to drive and we got a zip car for that, because I was like, you're not wrecking my car. So we pick it up and then you just go and do whatever. Yes. You go and do whatever and then you just drop it back off and you're charged just for the time that you use it, right?
Yeah, so Zipcar you actually pay hourly.
And actually, there is that plant at UCSB, there's this transportation alternatives program. You can actually, I've not tested this to see if it's true, supposedly you get a free Zipcar membership, supposedly. So,
Yeah, so you still have to pay for the hourly use of the car, but
Yeah.
like, they pay for the annual use of
Yes.
being a member.
so,
Yeah, so the Zipcar is nice because like they have dedicated parking spots. You
Yeah.
can leave it, so similar to bike share, you don't have to worry about where am I going to park this.
yeah.
You don't pay for gas because that's included in.
Oh, I didn't realize that, yeah. Oh, cool.
So I think it's giving people a lot more options. So when you're living in the city, like you might be like, hey, I think I can do a car-free lifestyle, but I still want to get groceries by car because I love them like 7 blocks or something. So I think it's just giving people more options. Like, hey, I don't have to have a car because I still have the option to use a car sometimes.
Right, just when I need it.
All right, well, we're just about out of time, so if you guys would please thank our guests.